In this video, I'm going to go over how I made the Dual Engine Go Kart from scratch. This also applies to any go-kart you want to make from scratch. The basic steps I followed are: I had a basic design in mind. I knew I wanted to fit 2 people on the go-kart. I knew I wanted to use 2 engines. I knew I wanted it to be long enough for an average size adult. Second step, I needed to source parts. I needed to know what size diameter wheels and tires to use, what size chain, things of that nature. Third step is, once I got these parts, I fit them together to make sure there were no clearance issues and they function together as I envisioned them. If they don't fit, immediately return them. Fourth step is to start assembling, welding, and designing. Keeping in mind how much load is going to go through each part. If you're not doing any calculations, make sure it looks twice as big as you think it should, just in case. Fifth step is to start testing. Stuff might break or come loose, so there's a lot of fixing you're going to have to do in this stage. With that, let's get started. So the first step I did is I got a piece of plywood to make a flat surface. I laid out a basic frame. I knew roughly where I wanted to sit, so I put 2 cross members. I knew where the axle was going to be. It was going to be behind the engine, so I put it roughly where it should be. And I put 2 pillow block bearings to hold a mock axle. At this point, I sourced the 2 engines from Harbor Freight, so I put them roughly where they were going to go. I also got wheels and tires. I think I'm using 13 or 15 inch rears, so I lined them up roughly where the axle will go. Here I am supporting the frame. I used clamps to clamp the pillow block bearings to the frame, and they are supporting the full load, so the engines are just sitting on a loose piece of steel, and I have the 2 sprocket and hubs lined up in line with the sprockets of the engine. Here I've made a seat, so I just cut 2 pieces of plywood and sat them there. Here, these are used to hold the front axles, so the axles will actually be welded right to these. All I did was use angle iron and weld one on top of the other. You can see this is one piece going right here, and the second piece is just butted up against it, welded. The structural welds are right here and down here. These are just to cover up the cracks because they look bad. So at this point, I've welded on the axle, which is just a 5/8 inch bolt I got from Lowe's. The head is welded right here. I coped the head slightly with an angle grinder, so it would be round and fit up flush with the pipe that I used. I think all I used was 3/4 inch Schedule 40 pipe. And of course a bolt goes through this piece in the bottom all the way through here and up here. That way you could steer. It pivots about that bolt. This is a close-up of the axle, this piece, and this is welded here, so this right here will be welded directly to the frame. Here I am mocking up roughly how high I need the steering wheel to sit for it to be comfortable. So I'm just holding it up right here temporarily. This is just loose. It's just wedged up in here. I'm still deciding where the seat needs to go, so this is still just a piece of steel I'm sitting on. Here I've welded where I need the front tires to go. So it's important because your tie rods will attach to this arm right here. So you need to make sure there's clearance of where your feet are going to end up in the pedals. Here it looks like I have permanently attached the steering wheel to the shaft. So I welded a few more pieces. Looks like I've drilled holes for the brake and gas pedal. It's just a hole drilled straight through this tubing right here, so you could pivot. Here I've welded a little bottom plate just so I could rest my feet while I'm continue to fit up. Here, to get the angle correct, I'm just fitting whatever I can so it matches up and it feels comfortable where my hands are. Here I've made the actual supports, so I just have two pieces of tubing I cut. I weld them at the bottom, and in between them I stick a slightly oversized piece of tubing so the shaft fits inside and can rotate within this. So here I have the plates that the engines will sit on. You can see I've drilled holes and I've welded them. I've probably welded on the bottom as well by this point. As you can see over here by the steering, same thing, I have an oversized piece of tubing and it's welded. It's hard to see, but there's a little gusset right here for the main attachment point. The tie rods will go straight from this piece to the arm over here. So when you turn, this moves, this rotates, this also rotates, and that's how you steer. Here I'm just taking measurements of the bearing size so I can make a spacer for the axles. Here are the tie rods attached, and it looks like so you have to cut them to the correct length. It'll be a custom fit. They thread inside of here, so you can make them slightly longer. It's best to make them long because you could. It doesn't matter if they go on the inside, but if you run out, you're gonna have to get a new piece. Here is a return spring for the pedal. Looks like I'm running the throttle cables up front. Since you have two engines, the two throttle cables need to attach to the same point, but when you press on the gas pedal, they need to pull by the same amount, or one engine will be either leading the other engine or lagging. So here is attaching the chain. So here's the sprocket and the centrifugal clutch on the engine, and the driven sprocket is right here. You can't see it, but this is the hub. Here's a clearer view. So you have the chain going on the centrifugal clutch, going back to the driven sprocket. It's attached via this hub. These are all the pillow block bearings that are supporting the axle. So the axle goes through all of these. This is the brake, so it's just a drum and a band will go across it for friction. So the way this brake works is I just got a piece of rebar and it attaches to a band. It's just a long curved piece of rubber attached to steel. So you pull on this and it just rubs on that drum that I showed earlier. So you press on the pedal, it pulls forward, and motion is transferred along this piece of rebar. And I made little holes that I welded to the frame. They're just little pieces of plate to keep this in line. The issue I did run into is because this rebar is really weak, it kept on wanting to bend. It wanted to open up this curve right here, so I added a piece of reinforcement. And the issue is same thing, is because it was wanting to bend everywhere. I ended up having to put a few pieces of metal in between the rebar and the frames that it could rub on. Here I decided it was too open and was unprotected, so I added some handlebars right here. It's just tubing welded directly to the frame going up, so you can put your hand on each side and hold on to something. I got a rear bumper and a front bumper. I made sure that it cleared the wheel, so if I hit something it wouldn't damage your steering. At this point, these are those pieces I added that the rebar can rub against when you brake, when it flexes. I just took some junk. I think they came from old bench presses. I got them out of the dumpster. And this is the finished product. One issue I did have on the clutches, when you get, I mean, they're very cheap, so they were like $20 off of eBay. Is the first thing I should have done is disassemble them and clean them up and make sure there's no grease in between the shoes where they rub on the brake, because they were slipping and it eventually burned one out. Also, the gearing I chose, I think I used a 60 tooth rear, and the gearing was way too high for if you were to run just one engine, so it would strain it. What I would have done differently is put a 72 tooth to get a little more torque, or run a torque converter. But I think the best thing would have been to run a 72 tooth. Also, change out the oil in these little engines fairly soon, because when I did change it, it was full of metal shavings. I changed it with Mobil 1 full synthetic. I think I used 0W20 and it's been fine, no leaking or burning oil. And really good engines, they start up every time. I've been running them frequently, once a month, and I have fuel stabilizer. Here are spacers that I made at a later point. I think I originally had tubing, but they looked horrible, so I machined pieces of aluminum that were custom fit, and I tightened the nut on the axle so there's just enough force on the bearing so there's no play in the wheel, but it's still loose enough where it'll spin freely. So also, this is a spacer basically right here on the axle. So whenever you compress the outside nut on the wheel, you need something to stop to lock the wheel, or else it would keep on moving inward. So there's a spacer that goes over the outside of the axle. You can see this is slightly larger, and it hits against the pillow block bearing and the inside of the wheel, and that way you bottom out the nut, and then you start making torque up right here. And that's it.